Yeah, juniors, you're back again. I'm wearing the same clothes because I recorded all these videos on the same day. So I'm not just wearing the same t-shirt. And in fact, I kind of have a little bit of a mullet situation going on, like a clothes mullet, because business professional up here, and I'm wearing sweats and comfy socks down on my lower half. Okay, I'm feeling comfy. We sure do have another book to discuss. Today we're in the book of James, but before we get to that PowerPoint, please pull up your agendas if you haven't already. I've got mine up here right now. This is the agenda for day number 27. It's, again, a little bit of a short agenda. We've got our devotional for the Heidelberg Catechism, day number 6. I'll give you a chance to pause the video here in a moment to do that. And then we're going to go over our PowerPoints. I want you to remember, though, look at me. Don't look at that. Don't look at anything else. Just look at me. You need to be working on your research paper. You need to be working on your summaries and presentation if you haven't done it already. Remember that your presentation, I'm just going to let you guys slide a little bit because of the global circumstance, but you can just make up the PowerPoint, send that to me. I'll count that as your presentation as if you would have done it, okay? So good work. Good job. You're doing well. Let's now transition to the PowerPoint. If you don't have that up, pause the video and get it going, sweet child. But let's look at this PowerPoint now. It's such a pretty PowerPoint. I chose such a pretty and different template this time. Don't you think so? I think it's a cute one. I'm now going to slide number 2 of the PowerPoint, which is titled Important Info. Of course, I really hope that by now, at this point in the year, that you would have observed that I always actually start with this kind of information. I always tell you who the author is. I always tell you the date is, what the occasion is for writing. All right, so first thing we got to check out here is this book was written by a homeboy named James, who was the brother of Jesus, the biological brother of Jesus, the biological son of Mary and Joseph. Jesus was not the biological son of Joseph, of course. If you speak to people of different leans, theological leans, like folks in the Roman Catholic Church, they're going to say that James is not Jesus' brother, but probably a close family relative, like a cousin or something like that, okay? And the reason for that is they hold the virginity of Mary to be at a very high importance, which we do too. Okay, the date of this book that James would have written would have been written around AD 44 to 48, sometime in that time frame. I don't know what's wrong with these guys. It's as if they didn't know what the date was. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, they had their own way of keeping dates, and it was different than the way that we keep dates and years. James wrote this book for a reason, or this letter for a reason. I just ruined my do. Okay, and the occasion for this writing, for James' writing, he was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and he wants to write to former parishioners who have had to leave Jerusalem to take up lives elsewhere. Okay, and that kind of goes into the recipients of this letter. We'll discuss that in a couple of slides, but before we get into who the actual recipients were and what I mean by those who had to leave Jerusalem, we'll talk about that in a second. But for now, let's go to the next slide, slide number 3, titled Themes. All right? With the themes, the overall theme is expressed actually in chapter 4, verses 4 through 5, and it kind of goes like this. Believers must commit themselves wholeheartedly to their God, who demands absolute allegiance. That is the primary overall theme of the entire book of James, okay? But we do have at least 3 subordinate themes. So keep these in mind, okay? Because these pop up throughout the book of James when you read it. First, encouragement for believers who are suffering trials. Like we discussed in our Hebrews PowerPoint, the time leading up to the destruction of the temple and after the destruction of the temple was a very hard time for Christians. They're being persecuted, they're being abused in many different ways by people in their cultures and people in their areas. And so he's writing to encourage those believers who were not in Jerusalem, who were still facing trials. So another subordinate theme here is he's trying to convey, in many ways, God's perspective on wealth and poverty. Okay, on wealth and poverty. And the last subordinate theme we'll cover in this lecture is the need for biblical faith always to show itself in the form of good works. Okay, sometimes people will take the book of James and use it as a way to say that we do have a works-based faith, that we have to do things in order to secure our own faith. And that is the antithesis of the gospel. The gospel says that Jesus died for our sins, not that we had to do something, but Jesus did. The work was done by Jesus, so we don't have to do anything. And yet people will look at the book of James and see how it says that we have to do good works. Those who have faith do good works. And they say, see, you gotta do good works in order to have faith or to have your faith be proven. And it's like, well, you may be misunderstanding a bit because the book of James does not support a works-based faith. All it does is show you what a person who has genuine faith will live. It shows you how they will live. Let's go here to the next slide, slide number 4, titled Recipients of the Letter. So I said under the occasion part a couple slides back that James was writing to the people who had to leave Jerusalem and live elsewhere, okay? So James states in chapter 1, verse 1, that he is writing to the scattered 12 tribes. And this could indicate that he is writing to Jewish Christians or even just to Jews, okay? The word scattered refers not to the Jews who lived in the Jewish epicenter of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the Jewish Christian stronghold, okay? But he's talking to those who are in the diaspora, all right, the diaspora. Again, I learned to say that word from a guy who had a southern accent, and so I think I probably say that with a southern accent, just like with some of my Greek. I was taught Greek by a guy with a southern accent, so I think I pronounce it differently than a lot of people might. But he's talking about the diaspora, and that means the Jews who were spread throughout the area of Palestine and who were not living in the central location of the Jewish faith, which was Jerusalem. Okay? So another thing here is the Jews who lived in the diaspora were viewed as exiles. Okay? They were viewed as exiles. There are people who chose to live outside the mother hub of all things religious. So they are viewed as exiles. Another important thing to know about the recipients of this letter is their status as exiles kind of explains the mention of hardships that James references in chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And some of the hardships that they were facing were being taken to court by wealthy people, and they're also being oppressed by landowners. So this view of these people as being less than Jews who were viewed as exiles and had abandoned the mother hub of all things Jewish were potentially, most likely, dealing with hardships as a result of that perception of who they were. I've got here this last point of this slide. There's another slide, so it's not the last point of the PowerPoint. But I'm just going to read it word for word, and I'm going to explain so that you understand. This understanding of their socioeconomic background is argued to be key when understanding and interpreting the book of James, but this goes down the road of liberation theologians, meaning theologians who advocate a Christian brand of socialism and communism. Here's how I specifically got that idea from a liberal commentator. And I don't believe that. I just included it here to show you how some people understand the book of James. Because what people will do is say, hey, look, the recipients of the book of James were people who were poor, and the writer was writing to them initially, James was writing them initially, in order to tell them that they don't need to be poor. And they are supposed to, given their socioeconomic background, how they were poor and viewed as lower, we need to understand that and see and come up with a Christian approach to socialism and communism. And I don't believe that is really a key way to understand the book of James in the slightest. The Bible itself, I don't think truly advocates for a Christian brand of socialism. We've discussed this in class a bit in previous lectures in class before. But I want you to be aware that this is one understanding that people have. So this idea of a liberation theologian is someone who advocates for a Christian brand of socialism or communism. In fact, there was a famous president who was around not too long ago, I won't say any names, very significant person. Anyways, he considered himself to be a liberation theologian and kind of to uphold to that. I heard him say that in one interview, and if I can find that, I will link it. I guess otherwise it's not true. All right, let's go to the next slide here, slide number 5. Importance of the author. That's this slide here that we're reading now. This is the last slide of the lecture for today. But before and after Jesus, there were people who claimed to be the long-awaited Messiah and had a significant following. Okay, so the author, being the relative, I would say the brother of Jesus, is important. Okay, at the time of Jesus, before and after, and probably during, there were other people who claimed to be the Messiah, who had significant followings. And some of these false messiahs had a following that was so great that their adherents were actually zealots. If you've ever heard that word in the Bible before, zealot. A zealot is someone who followed what the person who they thought was a Jewish Messiah and were seen as extremists. Okay, so there's actually a book out there called Zealot, written by a guy whose name I forget, and it's a secular book written by a secular guy who makes the claim that Jesus was just another one of these zealots. But we know that isn't the case, okay? Because here's the pattern of false messiahs and their followers at the time of Jesus. Usually, those false Christs would die or they would be killed, and the mantle of leadership would be passed on or picked up by someone who was closely related to the false Christ, such as a brother, okay? And that brother or that close relative would be the one who continued the movement and would assume the title of Messiah. All right, so it's significant that James, the brother of Jesus, is still holding to that Jesus is the Messiah and that he's not trying to assume that mantle himself. I think that gives some credence to the concept of Christianity, because all the other brands and the popular thing to do, the thing that was accepted back then, would have been to just have the mantle of leadership picked up by someone who was a close relative to the person who was the acclaimed Messiah. So this example, this cultural example that we see, was opposite from the Christian example, where the movement was started by the movement was started by Jesus, number one. Number two, it did not die out, and the messiahness, the messiahship, did not transfer to Jesus' brother, which would be James. That is very significant. And so instead of becoming the new Messiah, James merely continued to follow the commands of Jesus. He just was a faithful believer who led the church in Jerusalem, and that speaks to the validity of the Christian movement and also to the resurrected Christ. Imagine the temptation and the ease that would have existed for Jesus or one of his followers to just have picked up the mantle, claimed that the Messiah rights have been transferred on to them, and to continue on a zealot movement and a false Messiah movement. That was the brand at that time. That was the example given to people of what the Messiah kind of looked like, and Messiah movements looked like. And yet, that didn't happen. And part of the reason why that didn't happen is not only is the Christian faith authentic, but we have the resurrected Christ. In our understanding, Christ is not dead at this time. Christ is the head of the church. And being the head of the church, he is still alive. And so we follow Jesus, not Jesus' brother or Jesus' relative. And so I think this stands to kind of suggest that at least James and the other early believers genuinely believed that Jesus had been resurrected. So they authentically believed their account of the resurrected Jesus, which is important and significant. Students, blessings on you. God bless you. I pray that you are keeping your mind and your body active. I'm trying to do both. We seem to be having some good weather. At least when I'm recording this, it's actually kind of cold outside and it's supposed to snow. But I think in the future, when you're watching this, it'll probably be a few decent days. But bless you and care about you.